business. Well, hello, boys and girls. Graduate students, welcome to Business and Its Environment. Today, we've got corporate social responsibility, better known as CSR, which we'll get to in just a moment. I just want to remind you that I've posted discussion bonus point topics 1 and 2 for you, as well as your first ethics paper assignment. As I've mentioned previously, I recommend that you work ahead because some weeks have more obligations than others. And so I think it works to your benefit to try and stay a little bit ahead because you've got lots to do. Now, today, corporate social responsibility is one of my very favorite topics, and I've got my little Oriental hat on today because CSR is certainly an international subject that I think everybody should be interested in. So I think we begin with our French philosopher Voltaire, who says that, look, before you address me, define your terms. And so what does corporate social responsibility actually mean? And so I think researchers have said, well, look, CSR is the duty of a corporation to create wealth in a manner that avoids harm to the public, that protects or enhances societal assets. Now, clearly, this subject of CSR has evolved, that is, grown over time. And so we're back to, duty, the duty of a corporation. What does duty mean? Well, when I taught at West Point from 1980 to 83, the cadets taught me that duty meant doing what ought to be done. Or some people have suggested that, business has an ethical duty to use its power fairly. And I think that's a good characterization, that business has an ethical duty to use its power fairly. And so the question is asked, well, should all companies be interested in practicing CSR? Well, that's what we're going to explore today. There are essentially 3 arguments that have been presented why CSR is an ethical duty for businesses today. The first one is to promote social justice. Well, what is that? Well, that it has concrete, benefits that, such as creating loyal customers. Well, clearly business wants to be in business of providing high quality goods and services. But besides doing that for customers, what do customers do for business? Well, research discloses that in a successful business, over 80% of their customers are repeat customers. That is, they've had such a positive experience with that business previously, they come back. And I think that's an excellent characterization of CSR, that, look, doing good brings rewards of many different types. Let me give you an example. Several years ago, I took a group of students to Germany, to Wolfsburg, Germany, which is the international home of Volkswagen. And we had different executives from VW come in to, explain what their division department did, and obviously addressing, the international sales of their automobiles. And we had this one very interesting marketing executive from VW who, instead of lecturing us on what they did in marketing, asked if the class could help him by giving him some ideas as to how Volkswagen might be able to sustain their customer relationship after the point of sale had been completed, because they not only wanted their Volkswagen customers to have their cars serviced at VW dealerships, but more importantly, they wanted these VW customers to come back to be part of that, 80% group. And so he was asking us, asking our students from their perspective, since they were young millennials, what ideas did they have that Volkswagen might employ to sustain their customer VW relationship? Well, to my complete surprise, we broke up the students into groups, and they had German students that came from a local university that worked with them. And they spent several hours coming up with all sorts of interesting ideas. And then lunchtime came around, and they asked if they could go back to the youth hostel where they were staying, because they wanted to dress up and convert their work to some PowerPoints and all. So it was about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Everybody comes back, and boy, all these students are dressed to kill. And I'm sitting in the back with a German professor colleague of mine, and we're the most surprised people in the room, because this thing is sort of taken off, and we haven't really organized this. This is really sort of a make it up as you go along situation that was started by this Volkswagen marketing executive. Well, the students got up and gave these remarkable presentations as to what they believed Volkswagen could do to sustain the customer VW relationship, such as sending keychains, for example, to customers, once a year. Sending birthday cards and Christmas cards to purchasers each year, and inviting them to come once a year to a VW celebration. And when customers came to get their cars that they had purchased at the VW plant, that they make a circus, if you will, a big deal out of the customers coming, and make it an event. And so, to my complete surprise, Volkswagen did that. And they created this tower where they put all these VWs that had been ordered and produced. And when the customers came, they had this very large arena where the cars would, after coming down from the, and they had a camera that would that was on the car in the tower, and as it made its way down all the way to the bottom to exit to come into this arena, and there's music playing, and I mean, it was a circus. It was an incredible circus. And so there are these, new owners standing there waiting for their car to come in, and there's this music playing, and the drapes get drawn, and out comes their car. Well, it was a big deal, and obviously created a very memorable event for those new Volkswagen purchasers. So there were lots of ideas like that that the students gave that, to my complete surprise, Volkswagen implemented on at least a German, basis. And so I think Volkswagen bought into the idea of social justice, that there are concrete benefits to be gained by using power, its corporate power, positively. So the third argument is that, especially when operating in a global environment where there may be little government regulation, the right thing to do is obviously to use your power and your influence in a positive way. Now, there are arguments that CSR, is and can be opposed from a political point of view. On the far left, we got progressives who argue that, hey, it's an insufficient substitute for tougher laws and regulations. But as we've discussed in the past, to every action, there's a reaction. And when business misbehaves, as it did in 2000, 2001, we got Sarbanes-Oxley in January 2002. When it misbehaves in 2008, we get Dodd-Frank. And so we know that there are negatives attached to abuse of corporate power. Conservatives, argue that look, CSR violates free market economic doctrines. Do you buy that? I'm not sure I do. Certainly, CSR in some cases can impose costs that make corporations perhaps less efficient. But again, you've got to think about the long term, the long view. CSR, I see it as an investment, a good investment that a company is making in all the stakeholders. And when everybody wins, hey, that's a good thing, I would submit, in business. Arguments are made that, it's unfair that shareholders should receive less dividends because the company is investing in social projects. Well, again, I see it as an investment, a good investment, again, in the long run. We're back to the 80% that, customers come back to businesses that they enjoy doing business with, as opposed to businesses they do not enjoy doing business with. So we've seen, certainly as we discussed, last week, historically, the evolution of business from the 19th to the 20th and now the 21st century. And there's certainly is the argument argued by the University of Chicago School of Business that, argues that, look, the purpose, as Milton Friedman would argue, the purpose of business is to make money for shareholders. It's all about maximizing profits, and as long as they do that within the bounds of the law, then that's what a business should be about. It shouldn't be about trying to do good for society. I'm not sure those are incompatible objectives, especially when looking at stakeholders and trying to create a win-win proposition. And we'll talk more about that. So certainly historically, as we saw last week, in the 19th century, hey, American merchants were, thrifty, but charity was also a virtue. And business owners gave to churches, orphanages, and poorhouses. In the 1800s, we saw entrepreneurs such as Stephen Girard, who you read about in your chapter, who gave large gifts and bequests to schools and other worthwhile causes. So what's wrong with that? Seems to me that's a good thing. And as I mentioned last week, at your funeral, what do you want people to say about you? Do you want to have on your headstone that you increased the stock value, the share value of your company 200% during your lifetime? Is that what you really want on your headstone? I don't think so. Social Darwinism, is the philosophy that, businesses should survive on the basis of, survival of the fittest. And that the idea of win-win propositions, is just a do-gooder's waste of resources. It's all about dog eat dog, and whoever gains the most, wins. What a limited view of business. What a terribly criticism, I think, of a business's purpose in existence. And so I think there's more to business than social Darwinism by a long shot. And so certainly in the 20th century, we've seen some significant growth in the CSR concept, where we have managers being viewed as trustees of corporate power, and they have an obligation to manage the interests of the various stakeholders. So what's wrong with that? Clearly, your best businesses are concerned about your employees. You certainly are concerned about your customers. And, of course, you have to be concerned about your shareholders. and the public at large. Your reputation, your brand, is critical to success of a business. Having your brand suffer severe criticism, as Wells Fargo, for example, is receiving, that's a really bad thing for business. They put a lot of investment into building brands, and yes, it can be tarnished quite easily, as Wells Fargo is discovering. So, there certainly are folks historically who were fairly ruthless and believed in social Darwinism, and certainly Henry Ford was one of those. But General Robert Wood, who was the president of Sears and Roebuck, had a different view and thought, look, business can expand and do good for society, and that's a good thing. Well, we've discussed Milton Friedman, and he says, look, the only purpose of business is to make money for shareholders, and so having your company get involved in supporting the Children's Miracle Network or St. Jude's Children's Hospital is just a waste of resources, and businesses shouldn't be involved in that. Boy, what a limited view of the good that business can do. To make money, and that's it? That's the only purpose of going to work each day? What about, doing good for all the stakeholders? I don't see these as being mutually exclusive propositions. And so I think there is good to be done, and using power positively, I would suggest, is a good thing. So I think poor Milton Friedman's, view of life is a bit too narrow. I think he underestimates the good that business can do. Well, we're seeing over a period of time continued evolution, and I think Friedman's arguments are in the minority, and that most businesses today are, for the right reasons, attempting to use their power to advance the interests of all stakeholders. And when they try and take advantage of their situation and use their power selfishly, as we saw again in the Wells Fargo opening of fraudulent accounts scam, to every action there is going to be a reaction, and Wells Fargo is suffering through that now, and they haven't made their way out just yet. So there's the idea of three circles when talking about CSR evolution: an inner circle of responsibility of economic performance. So let's not lose sight of that. Of course, every business, even nonprofits like a health services or a healthcare organization like Vera or Sanford, of course they have to make money. If they don't make money, they go out of business. So of course, first and foremost, business has to make a profit or it will be out of business. So I think that is it's like air, it's intuitive. We all need air. So I don't think we need to explain that very often, but that businesses first and foremost obligation is to make a profit for its shareholders. I don't think any reasonable person would dispute that. Nevertheless, is that all a business is about? And so a second intermediate circle that requires the economic function, the power that a company exercises to be done with sensitivity to social values and priorities, stakeholders, I think is a good thing, a good thing. If you haven't heard of the Business Roundtable, you should. The Business Roundtable is made up of executives of some of our largest companies in America. And so they have a fairly strong position that they put out on CSR, saying that, look, business has both economic and social duties. So, hey, these are the best and the smartest folks that are out there, and I think they have a good argument there. So when we peel back the definition of CSR, what does it actually consist of? Certainly, we recognize that profit must be the first obligation for any business in order for it to survive. But in so doing, business creates jobs, pays taxes, meets consumers' needs, all good things for society. Now, my friend, consumer advocate Ralph Nader thinks corporations are the most pernicious entities in America. I think that, again, is a little over the top. There certainly are miscreants who from time to time do engage in behavior for which they are sanctioned and should be. But as a norm, I think most businesses seek to use their power in a positive way. So businesses do important social things like certainly making Social Security and Medicare, payments. Businesses alone, non-employees, pay for unemployment insurance. So when there are layoffs, when unemployment insurance kicks in, and certainly there are other benefits that businesses provide employees. So there are essentially 8 accepted principles of CSR. The first one we would all agree with, that corporations are run for the purpose of profit. Second, that they all have to follow the law. There are lots of different types. Certainly we have what are called housekeeping, corporate rules and policies. We certainly have civil and criminal law. And of course we have regulations and international law as well. And so my course metaphor, if you will, for this course is, the rules in business matter. And so certainly civil and criminal law, not to mention these other legal sources I've mentioned, they matter. They matter. They affect people's lives. And so I sometimes like to compare business to sport. And can you imagine any sport? So let's say volleyball or basketball or, wrestling or whatever. Imagine that sport with no referees and no rules. Well, you can't picture that, can you? It would be a pretty awful scene. And so it is with business, that we need to have rules in order to properly regulate business activity. When it comes to ethics, of course, we don't think ethics are optional in business, because if they are, then you are going to have these ethical smash-ups, as we have seen and as your daily Wall Street Journal relates. As a norm, of course, business is highly ethical. Are there miscreants out there that violate the norm? Yes, the Wall Street Journal reports them almost daily, and I'm glad they do. So certainly corporations have a duty to correct adverse social impacts that they cause. The classic one, of course, is the environment. Do no harm to the environment. Social responsibility certainly has characteristics as to size and location. I believe there's a big to-do right now about where Amazon is going to build their next plant. And so we've got lots of cities from Philadelphia to Atlanta who are competing to try and get that location of growth of Amazon's business. So, and as I go back, as I mentioned earlier, I think managers have an affirmative obligation to do the best they can to meet the multiple needs of stakeholders. Clearly there is conflict from time to time, but that's life, right? That's life. And so we have to sort out the conflict, prioritize the needs of the stakeholders, and in good faith, ethically do the best we can within the bounds of the law to meet as many expectations as are reasonable under the business circumstances. And of course, transparency is a new and new demand in the area of business, and that companies, not only with their annual reports, but their annual meetings, are supposed to be transparent on regarding the good, the bad, and sometimes the very ugly. Are social and financial performances related? Well, there is research to show that the more responsible companies out there are at least as profitable than companies, that are rated as less responsible. So there is some research to show successful companies, are responsible in their behavior. And it certainly, CSR has taken on a global dimension. While it varies certainly by culture, so CSR in Africa or Latin America or Southeast Asia may be substantially different than the way it is in the European Union or the United States. Nevertheless, there are, if you will, varieties of what it looks like. And we certainly see more of it, more sensitivity to it in our developed economies as opposed to our developing ones. Now, international law is sort of in a way, an oxymoron in the sense that, so how is international law enforced? International law consists of treaties, codes, regulations, principles, but their enforcement may in fact be very limited in terms of agencies that attempt to enforce it. And so more often than not, by custom and treaty, nations agree to act or behave in a certain way regarding the environment or things of that nature. And it's no surprise that less developed nations have weaker regulations because they're developing, right, as we did. So while we have international law and treaties, a number of United Nations treaties, we have lots of bilateral treaties and multilateral treaties among nations. Nevertheless, domestic regulation really governs how business will operate, even overseas, as we have seen with the recent tax bill enactment. Again, one of the purposes being to try and help bring back from abroad a lot of money that corporations have overseas. So I think it is accurate to say there is global CSR that is in fact evolving. And as nations trade together, realizing that, look, we have to trade friendly in order to be able to export and import. And that in the United States is certainly front and center for debate and discussion right now with a new administration. We're going to be seeing some changes, certainly in a number of bilateral and multilateral treaties that the U.S. has subscribed to. There certainly are new norms and principles that are evolving, and that's why having this conversation is productive. Codes of conduct or formal statements of aspirations and principles and guidelines that come about as a result of what we call conventions, that is essentially meetings to help draft these things internationally, like the environmental treaty that unfortunately the U.S. withdrew from, but perhaps we'll return to it at some point in time in the hopefully not too distant future. But certainly management, that is leadership, affects CSR, goals. And so, if you will, the board of directors and the executive officers of a company certainly set the standards for CSR and its priority in company operations. As we previously discussed, NGOs, non-governmental organizations, can lobby and pressure and even sometimes demonstrate against or in favor of companies and principles and behavior that they believe should be inculcated in corporate behavior. Certainly multinationals, that is, companies that are doing business worldwide, and they have subsidiaries worldwide. These are certainly growth industries, and civil regulation goes along with cross-border regulation of business conduct. Now, your text offers the example of General Electric, which was initially established and formed by Thomas Edison, the inventor of the light bulb, right? But General Electric today is really a holding company. It has lots of different businesses that it operates, everything from building jet engines to, besides light bulbs, it runs mortgage operations, and they really have quite a few subsidiary companies. And so General Electric got themselves into an environmental catastrophe with the result of work that it was doing on the Hudson River and the resulting dissemination of PCBs, which are pollutants that certainly polluted the river. Now, we can all agree GE didn't set out to pollute the Hudson River, but the public, rightfully, and the government rightfully believes that since GE created the mess, they ought to clean it up. Well, the problem is, of course, it was going to be horrendously expensive. And so CEO Jack Welch, for the years of his tenure, fought the government tooth and nail on that issue, and the battle raged. And so the question became at annual corporate meetings, is GE behaving in an appropriate CSR manner by refusing to recognize and clean up its PCB pollution of the Hudson River? Now, while certainly GE has been profitable over the years, as this slide and your chapter demonstrate, but the question, becomes, yes, you've, created lots of wealth and have done lots of good things. Nevertheless, look, you have polluted the Hudson River, and this hurts communities. It's caused layoffs, factory closings. It's had all sorts of anti-competitive spillover effects. And so, hey, GE, we need you to get with the program and clean up your mess. Yes, it's going to cost a lot of money, but, this certainly demonstrated a narrow view of a corporate CSR, which would probably be closer to Milton Friedman's perception. How did GE comply with the general principles of corporate social responsibility? Well, while providing economic benefit is the most important responsibility for a company, and it excelled in that, clearly there was going to be a reckoning at some point in time, and I think that reckoning caught up with the GE that she is struggling with right now. And so there's been a change in CEOs at GE, and she has reversed policy position and is now seeking to clean up the Hudson River that the company polluted. It's going to be a lengthy endeavor. It's going to be expensive, but that's the downside of business behavior. Are you able to please everybody? Probably not. But are you acting in good faith to do the right thing? So was GE a more socially responsible corporation in the Welch era or the Jeff Immelt aftermath era? I think certainly the post-Welch era is the one that makes the most practical long-term sense for GE. Well, talking about CSR is one thing, but implementing it is another, right? Well, how about Bill Gates? You know, Bill Gates and his wife Melinda set up the world's largest philanthropic foundation. They've endowed it with initially with 37 billion. I think it's worth a lot more than that now. Well, why would a big business entrepreneur like Bill Gates establish an endowment? Well, he and his wife believe, as I tried to teach my students on a trip to Egypt that I think I may have mentioned in an earlier program. Look, you know, believe it or not, while the pharaohs tried to take their wealth with them, we can all agree on one simple fact: they failed. And so, since we know we can't take our wealth with us, so what should we do with it? And so, Bill and Melinda Gates have decided, look, they want to use their wealth positively. And so, they've set up this foundation to which a number of other wealthy people, such as the Oracle of Omaha, has also set up that all of his wealth will go to the Gates Foundation upon his demise. So the Gates Foundation philosophy is that, one, you know, all lives are of equal worth, and second, persons with great wealth have great obligations. Put differently, to whom much is given, much is expected. And so for the Gates Foundation, they have focused on diseases of the poor and on improving education. So there are, you know, certainly other organizations that have divided essentially up into three models. One is called the progressive business model that says, look, the business's strategy needs to meet market needs and mitigate social problems or improve, you know, society. That's the philosophy, the business model of the company. A more traditional model is emphasizing, you know, social responsibility. And certainly, as you saw in your text, in the Bertelsmann case and Johnson & Johnson are examples. So we've discussed before Johnson & Johnson Pharmaceuticals and the arsenic Tylenol case in 1983, where this nutcase put arsenic in a number of Tylenol bottles on the shelves in a pharmaceutical store in Chicago. And without being directed by the FDA or any governmental entity, Johnson & Johnson, knowing who they were, that their code of ethics was that they only produced products that are safe for medical care providers and patients, they withdrew all their products off the shelves worldwide until they could design, manufacture, and distribute what became the very first tamper-proof bottle top in the pharmaceutical industry. So they knew who they were, and they devoted everything they had to resolving that problem because it was their traditional business model that, according to their code, they only produce safe products, and when somebody jeopardized that, they were going to respond to that. And then, of course, there is a third model, which is one that large transnational corporations try and emphasize, and that they try and match their business not to a specific culture, but they try and get businesses to follow a particular good business philosophy. So, how might a business implement CSR? Well, certainly you have to figure out, before you can go anywhere, you have to figure out where you are to start with. And so, what is your company's current CSR setup? And of course, you're going to look at what your company's core values are and your code of ethics, I would hope. So this goes back to Sarbanes-Oxley in 2002 that mandates all publicly traded corporations need to have a code of ethics and a system not only for training and educating employees, but for conducting reviews. And so I think this is a good, certainly, opportunity for companies to review what are their core values and build their CSR program around those. Certainly, second, evaluating laws, regulatory requirements, your supply chain, stakeholder demands. Hey, these things are, significant, and you can, build your program around that. Designing a stakeholder map or a diagram, trying to focus on addressing the concerns of your stakeholders is another approach. So you can see there are a variety of options that are available to companies in analyzing where they are and where they ought to go in designing, implementing, executing a CSR, program, or if you will, a CSR strategy. And I found, including all your stakeholders in helping to develop that strategy is a positive thing. It gets early buy-in. Now, as in most business plans, one needs performance goals and timelines. And so that can be done with CSR goals as well, because they're part of the company's goals. And so I invite you to look at companies' corporate reports, publicly traded companies, because they routinely report in their annual reports how they are progressing on their CSR performance goals and timelines. And certainly reporting on how you're doing at the end of the day is important to sustaining any CSR program that you are executing. Everybody wants to know. In fact, I remember the mayor of New York City, famous mayor, his name was Ed Koch. And what he used to do, which I thought was remarkable, is he would go out every day during the lunch hour and he would stop pedestrians on the street and introduce himself. Hi, I'm Mayor Ed Koch, and I wanted to ask you, how am I doing in terms of, the city of New York? That's what he'd ask people. And they would give him, off the cuff, candid observations. Well, the garbage isn't getting, cleaned up properly. Well, we need, better police protection in certain areas. And so he was famous for doing that and for implementing those types of changes that made New York City the great city that it is today. So certainly philanthropy, that is, giving to various, charities, is a good thing. And we had a chance to see in your chapter that, the Rockefellers and the Carnegies and whatnot, they waited until they died before they set up their foundations that gave away all the money that they had accumulated, whereas Bill and Melinda Gates are taking, I think, a more proactive approach, trying to do something positively with their wealth while they're still alive. And I think they're to be commended for that. Now, again, as far as business strategy, having a philanthropic strategy is a good idea. Checkbook philanthropy simply says, look, we're going to give away to a variety of worthy causes that have no link to our business whatsoever. So clearly, a business, writing a check each year to the St. Jude's Children Network or other similar types of charities certainly are important. Strategic philanthropy is a little different because it aligns a corporation's business mission with its charitable mission. So this actually came about in the 1980s. That money wasn't just distributed for altruistic purposes, rather it's linked partially in support of commercial objectives. Let me go back here a little bit here. Cause marketing, it's a form of strategic philanthropy. Contributions are based on purchases of an item. You've seen that at a number of stores who say, look, if you buy a product, we will donate X cents of the purchase price to this particular philanthropic cause. Cause marketing, very, very popular. And so, yeah, good intentions need to be translated into to action. And so that begins with a strategy. What is your CSR company strategy? Now, your chapter went into agonizing detail about the Nike case. And clearly, like a number of businesses, Nike set up factories or entered into contracts with manufacturing companies overseas to try and produce, shoes and other Nike products at the lowest price possible. Well, the unfortunate reality was that a number of these manufacturing plants were essentially sweatshops that employed children, among others. And so this, boomeranged on Nike as to, well, what type of CSR do you have that you're employing children at $1 a day to, make your shoes? And so Nike caught a lot of heat over that. Nike tried to defend by saying, look, we're not responsible for, weak labor laws. We're just, trying to make a profit here. And so there was the argument made, look, if they didn't employ these children and women and whatnot, they would be sentenced to prostitution and other types of horrific existences if they didn't have, this job. Well, but nevertheless, this boomeranged on Nike, and perhaps Nike should have anticipated this. They tried to react by hiring Andrew Young and others to go into some of these factories and give eyewitness reports as to what were the working conditions. Has Nike created and implemented an effective approach to CSR? Well, I suppose it depends on your point of view. So they tried to, set up some new compliance standards with their subsidiary companies and contractors to try and get them to improve the working conditions. But the way Nike ordered its products exacerbated some of the working condition situations in Southeast Asia, companies. And so Nike needed to learn to conduct enforcement audits to see that its mandates or requirements were being met. But there were still problems. And of course, many of these may be related to culture as well as local government situations. And so these are the risks and the problems of, overseas manufacturing. How about the California Supreme Court case, the Caskey case about commercial speech? Here we've got the state Supreme Court of California saying, look, speech is commercial if it comes from a business, is intended for an audience of consumers, and makes representations about the company's products. So, well, some of the justices in the dissent thought it was an overly broad definition. Bottom line is, certainly the First Amendment applies to business as it does to individuals, but business does not have a legal right or a constitutional right to lie or to provide falsehoods. And they can be held accountable, as Nike was getting, attacked for a number of their statements that were being claimed to be false. So I think these are good questions to ask. What is the line between commercial and non-commercial speech? I think the Caskey case is a good example. So I would submit that this is going to be a continuing conversation about commercial speech, and I think most normal people would say, look, businesses do not have a right to defraud the public or to falsely engage in commercial speech that may harm the public. And so, yes, people have a right to object and call Nike and other companies out when they are making false statements. So I think we're going to hear more about this in the days to come. Well, boys and girls, this is more than maybe you signed up for today for our lunch hour, but I wanted to share these thoughts with you, and I invite again your questions or comments, and I also think that if there's anything you need, please contact me. Many hands make light work. I look forward to hearing from you. Bye-bye now.